I'll save you all the time from reading the book, The Productivity Project, and I'll give you the cliff notes. Here they are. Hey, my name is Michael Thompson. I'm a youth pastor and a student, and on this channel, we talk about personal and professional development from a Christian perspective. And we got a book review today. This book is called The Productivity Project by Chris Bailey. I actually did this book on Audible, so I don't have the paperback cover. But the basic premise of the book is that Chris Bailey, instead of going and working a job when he finished college, he took a year to experiment on himself, and he did some pretty unusual experiments. One of them was meditating for 35 hours a week. Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. I don't want to do that. He also worked 90 hours in a week. He woke up at 5:30 every morning, and then he was experimenting also with going to the gym and living in isolation for 10 days. And he includes helpful experiments, and he talks about the productivity concepts that he learned through these different experiments. He didn't do all of these for the whole year, but he alternated what he did. I thought this book was really good. He talks about living like a monk is too slow, but then also living like a stock trader is too fast. And as people, we need to find a spot in between those two different paces of work. We'll break this book down into three different areas: time, attention, and energy. And then we'll talk about different ways you can manage each one of those. First area of productivity is your time. And he talks about organizing your day. He says that the most people arrange and rearrange their day, and they experiment with the best ways to do work. He said that his peak performance time was between 10 to 12 and from 5 to 8 p.m. I thought that was a pretty interesting observation. And I think that the bigger idea here is that he's self aware. And if you, as a person, I mean, some jobs, if like you work at a factory, your job is set for you, and you don't necessarily have to work in the energy proficient times, and you don't have to really worry about that as much because you're just kind of clocking in and then doing what you're told. Whereas if you're someone who schedules your own time or you own a business, then you really want to make sure that you're working at the most efficient times. For him, it was from 10 to 12 in the morning and from 5 to 8 p.m. I think that sounds good as long as you're not married, because I'm married, and I know that if I went home and told my wife that my green zone was from 5 to 8 p.m., I'd be working that time every day. Marriage probably wouldn't be as good as it needs to be. So I think that that is helpful, but at the same time, different stages of life you have to think about and consider different things. So, but if you know when you work best, that's very helpful. I do use this app called the Forest app whenever I study. And I noticed that last year, 10 o'clock was my most efficient time. It like just gave me that stat. And so I have that in common with Chris. 10 o'clock, I was the most efficient with my time. Second big principle is that you need to manage your work time. And he talked about how 35 to 40 hours is actually the sweet spot. And this is kind of controversial because when people used to work in the factory, you were expected to be at work 40 hours a week. And there's not a lot of discussion about how productive you are in those 40 hours. It's mostly just show up. At least that's what I've read. I mean, I didn't live 100 years ago, but that's the general concept that I've been taught from people who did live during that time or talk about the world's philosophy. And today, there are so many jobs that you use your brain, and not that you don't use your brain in a factory, but you're responsible for creative or informational type work. Well, when you're using your brain that way, it's a much more cognitively demanding kind of work, and it may not necessarily be 40 and 50 hours that is the most efficient. It might be 30 to 40 hours. And I thought that was really interesting as a cool observation. And he said when it comes to writing and reading and those kinds of tasks, that 35 to 40 hours was ideal. He also worked 90 hours, and he said that it really wasn't sustainable. He's also very young when he wrote this book. I'm pretty sure he's like 26, I think I heard. And we all know the longer that you do things, the more experience you have, and you can become more efficient, and maybe your sustainable work output could go higher after time and after you have more experience. And so, he was younger when he wrote this, so maybe over time he could do more than 35 or 40 hours. Who knows? He also says at a certain point in time, you tend to do busy work. So you have a lot of energy to do the difficult things in your workday. But he said that once he consistently went over that certain amount of work, like over 40 hours, he tended to just do little tasks. And I thought that was kind of an interesting observation. The third area of your time that we're going to talk about is planning your time. And he talked about this exercise where you set an alarm. This sounds miserable to me, but you set an alarm for 30 minutes, and every 30 minutes the alarm goes off, and for a week you record what you're doing. And I think that that's cool, kind of. I don't know. I would be super miserable doing that. I propose a time blocking system instead, where you plan your time throughout the week, and then what I do is I go in my calendar and I update how long I spent on each task. That sounds a lot better than an alarm for 30 minutes for a whole entire week, but you do you, okay? If you want to do that, go for it. Kind of interesting. He said that some days go as planned and others are more difficult, and I think we all kind of know that. And he also said that the more impulsive you are, the more you tend to procrastinate. That was another observation he made when it comes to planning your time. And I've noticed that the people that I know that are the most spur of the moment, and we need people like that because they're way more fun than the really consistent people, but they also tend to be more procrastination oriented. And I think that it's a good example of how God has designed all of us differently. And we need to learn how to work together and use those different kinds of personalities. And there's different jobs that require creativity versus planning ahead of time. And I think that's a cool thing, and I think that's evidence of a creator. He designed us all to work well together. Time is the first area. Second area that you need to manage is your attention. He says that multitasking is actually a myth. He says your brain actually switches between each task, and you are much less efficient whenever you're multitasking, because what you don't realize when you're multitasking is that your brain does take time to switch in between the tasks, which takes more time than if you're just focused on one thing at a time. Thought that was kind of an interesting observation. He also says that multitasking, it can make you feel like you're doing more than you actually are. It makes you kind of feel more busy because you got more going on in your head, but you may not necessarily actually get more done. There's another book called Make Time that the guys who wrote that book, I did a book review on this book, but the guys who wrote it talked about how at Google they did sprints. So they would spend 5 days working on one big project. Instead of juggling 5 projects at a time, the team would go into just one project. And the amount of momentum that you get when you just focus on one thing for 5 days, he said, was a lot. And then they also were much more efficient. They called them sprints, work sprints. They were much more efficient doing that than working on multiple things at a time. So this has been proven in the workplace as well. He talks about the rule of 3. He says that in life, you need to identify, or in your work, you need to identify the 3 most important tasks, and also in life. He says that he gets this principle from Brian Tracy's book, Eat That Frog. I did a book review on that as well on the channel, but Brian Tracy talks about Mark Twain had a saying, eat that frog, and the frog is the ugliest and the most difficult task that you have to do every single day. And if you start your day off eating the frog, then you're going to be able to have a lot of momentum, and the rest of your day is going to be easier compared to the beginning, where when you have the most energy, you do the hardest task. That's kind of the concept there. Following the concept of eating the frog or doing the hardest thing at the beginning of the day helps you narrow down what you need to focus on, and it'll help you be more efficient. And another rule that is really helpful, it's an efficiency rule, is called the Pareto principle, and it says that 80% of the value that you provide in your job is accomplished through 20% of the tasks, meaning if you do 10 things, 2 things of those 10 are going to accomplish or 80% of the result that you are held accountable for. This is very helpful if you find out what is that 20% of your job, those 2 to 3 things, and how can you spend most of your week doing those 2 or 3 things. Sales guys will talk about how prospecting is that percentage that makes the biggest impact on the rest of their job. And it's common in sales to spend a lot of time doing a bunch of busy work during the day and not necessarily cold calling or reaching out to new business. And so what is it for you? Think about it. If you're a student, think about it. What is it for you that actually accomplishes the most in your job or in your school, and spend most of your time doing those things and put those in your calendar, and you'll be able to be much more efficient and accomplish things that other people aren't able to. The last area of attention is watch out for traps. He says that checking email is something that can hold you back, and it can keep you from accomplishing things that you need to accomplish. And some tasks feel more productive, but in reality, they are not. What are those for you? Everybody has something different. I know that as a youth pastor, one of the things that you can spend a lot of time doing is spending too much time on like cool stuff in the youth group. And it's like, okay, like cool and exciting is important, but if you spend 50% of your time in your job doing that rather than studying the Bible, or 50% of your time making something really, really cool or getting that perfect graphic instead of actually spending time with people, that's something that in my job, sometimes people can spend too much time doing that, and it doesn't actually move the needle forward in their job like it does when you spend time with people. So that's something for me. So what are some traps in what you do? Learn how to spend the right amount of time on the most important things, and you're going to be so much farther ahead than everybody else, and watch out for those productivity traps. The third area that Chris Bailey describes is your energy. So manage your time, manage your attention, and the third area is manage your energy. He says that managing time should take a back seat to energy management. And this is interesting. You'll find a few different guys with different perspectives. They're all saying the same thing. Instead of focusing more on the time blocking side of things, we should be more focused on working when our energy levels are at the highest peak. As I said earlier, for him it was 10 to 12 and 5 to 8 p.m. He was saying that basically working in those intervals is more important than maybe managing the time that you spend throughout the week. And he gives a highway illustration about if your brain is like a highway, then how fast the cars can move on the highway is based on how congested they are. Meaning, if there's on a highway, there's like 10 cars, they're not going to be able to move as fast as if there were two cars on the highway. And when he's talking about your energy, he's saying that when you focus on fewer things, you're going to be able to move them faster along your brain or the highway. And so we should focus on fewer things rather than focusing on too many things. He also talks about batching tasks. He says that if you can have a maintenance day, you can batch all the little things of the week and move them into a certain segment of the week where you're going to do little tasks. And that was actually in Brian Tracy's book, Eat the Frog, as well, because whenever you batch tasks, you're going to be much more efficient. I think it was in that book. Maybe it was somewhere else. I know that I heard that in one of my church organization and management classes back in the day. So he also says that your brain it's not meant for storing info, but for creating info. That idea is found in Getting Things Done by David Allen. He's kind of one of the guys who headed off the productivity movement and talked about having different folders for different tasks and things you're going to do throughout the year. But your brain, whenever you have a whole bunch of, like he would say, open loops, this is David Allen, he would say that if your brain has a bunch of things that you're constantly thinking about, they're like open loops, and it's less efficient. It's kind of like if you have a computer and it's not set up with a processor that can do a bunch of things at the same time, and then your computer starts like heating up and then the fan starts blowing, and it's like because there's so much going on, it's not able to be as efficient, whereas when you're just doing one thing on the computer, it's much faster. Same thing with your brain. He's saying that if you batch tasks, you're going to be able to be much more streamlined and use your brain for creating ideas and being more creative, which is what your brain is designed to do in the first place, not just store a bunch of information. David Allen would also say you should write down everything that your brain is responsible for. Like instead of trying to remember a reminder, when you write it down, you close the loop, and then you can have a mind that's like water, or you can be much more creative because you're not trying to remember things. It's kind of like the highway, right? If you are always remembering things, that's a bunch of cars. Whereas if you're only focused on one thing at a time and you're able to write the other things down, put them in a different system, then the creativity can flow and that one car or that two cars can move much faster. He also says that to manage your energy, you should set limits. He says setting limits for work actually makes you figure out how to get things done more creatively because, like Cal Newport would say, you could set quotas. That's something that he talks about in his podcast. He says he sets quotas for certain items or certain projects of the month. That way, he doesn't spend all of his extra time going towards extra projects that get added. He just sets a limit, and then when he's hit his limit, he's done. And then when you have that free time, you're able to think more creatively. He talks about sleep, Chris Bailey does, when he's describing energy. And when you cut back on sleep, it might seem like, okay, I get more time back whenever I take sleep out of my schedule. Like 2 hours of sleep, I can use that to work. Well, he cites some different information and says that if you take 1 hour of sleep away, it's 2 hours of productivity. So remember that when you're deciding, am I going to cut back on sleep to get a little bit ahead on something? Remember that every time you do that, you're actually slowing yourself down because you're not going to be as productive when you don't have the sleep that your body needs. The last area of focusing on the energy talks about exercise. He says that this is the most important tool you have. I heard one guy I think it was on YouTube or something, say, if I could tell you how to 10x your productivity and I could tell you how to be the most effective person in the room, and he just starts listing all these positive things. And he says, and it was a pill, would you take it? And everyone's like, yes. He's like, well, that pill is exercise. Do you do it? Or something like that. So he turned the table on everybody he was talking to. But this is true. If you don't exercise, you're not using your body the way that God has designed it. Like, we are all designed to be able to have exercise and be healthy. And whenever the technology revolution came around, we have all these jobs that we can just sit all day, and that's not very conducive to a healthy lifestyle. So if you don't exercise, then you're missing out on some really important things for your body. And then also it's going to cause medical problems in the future. So make sure you're exercising, and eating right is a part of that. Anyways, health is a big deal. He did an experiment with exercise. He tried to get down to 10% body fat, and he says that he thinks that he would have been able to do it, but he was too aggressive. And that's a really big point. When you want to make a change in your life, you can't bite off too much. I think in the book Atomic Habits, it's referred to as the Goldilocks rule. Don't do something too hard or too soft, something that's right in the middle. And when you're trying to change your lifestyle, start small. Don't try to do something that's too intense, or don't try to do too many things at once, because when you do that without having formed the habits, it's impossible to just completely turn your life in a 180 overnight. And he says that he took too aggressive of a path when it comes to eating to try to get down to 10% body fat. And then later on, he says that if he would have changed his methodology, like done it a little bit smoother or not as difficult, he feels like he would have been able to actually achieve that 10%. Pretty interesting. I have noticed this before because I have slowly crept up to a very strict diet, and that was much easier. And then at other times, different years, I'll remember, oh, well, I just did, this is what I ate in the morning, this is what I ate in the afternoon, this is what I ate in the evening. And I've tried to just jump back into that diet, and it didn't work. Like, I've actually not been able to sustain it. And I end up getting around sugar and binge eating because I didn't build myself up to that point. And at this point, I'm just trying to get into that whatever routine is going to sustain me for a very long time and build those habits. But I've done that before, where I was really consistent, had habits built, and lived a certain lifestyle, and later on wished I was doing that lifestyle again, tried to jump back into it, and it was just too much because I didn't ease into it. So he says 28%, this is crazy, of the population did not exercise in 2014. That's terrible. This is of the U.S. population. So make sure you're exercising. That's the most important thing you can do for your productivity and your health, and it changes your life. I hope you enjoyed this video. This is a book review on Chris Bailey's Productivity Project. If you want to know more about exercise and fitness, you can click this video here. Until next time, remember that productivity, it's not just about time management, but energy management. We'll see you in the next one.